also want to discuss architecture with you regarding Christianity. Before this, we've talked a lot about temples, and now we're going to be moving into talking about churches and mosques. So a little bit of a difference. But one thing that's important to understand about the churches, the early Christian churches, is they were originally modeled off of Roman basilicas. So you can go look at a model plan, right, of a Roman basilica, which were used for business, and they basically were converted by Christians, right, into the role of church. So basically taking the shape, but, changing the function and changing it around a little bit. And so what I have for you here is the plan of Old St. Peter's and the interior photograph of Santa Sabina. The reason why I'm showing you a different church in the photograph is because Old St. Peter's no longer exists. So during the Renaissance and the Baroque eras, St. Peter's was actually renovated by Michelangelo, Bernini, and some of the bones are still there essentially, but it doesn't look anything like this anymore, like the original plan. So again, you really can't show photos of it and get your point across. So I'm showing you Santa Sabina, which is a very similar axially planned church, right? It has that same design and structure and gives you a sense of the space that Old St. Peter's would have had. And again, on the left, you can see the plan. And it's what we call an axial plan. And basically the axial plan, right, has a straight line visually. So you'll notice if you come in the gate, you'll move through the atrium, which was usually an open air space, through the narthex, right, which was a place for people to stand and gather. Today it's usually where people have like the program or the sign-in book or whatever. And then you enter into the sacred space of the nave and you move down towards the apse, where the altar would be. So you notice your eye is always moving forward, straight line, from one end to the other of the structure. So the axial plan, I always nickname it the straight line plan, because it's basically leading your eye on a straight line all the way down to the altar. Boom, bam, there it is. It's a very uncomplicated plan. It wants you to conceive of the space in the simplest way possible, so you understand the usage of it. So again, it's very basic, right, in how it's outlined. And I see this a lot with early Christianity. Their structures are very basic. They're very humble. They're very simple. You notice there's really not a lot of decoration on the interior. There's really only one painting above the altar. We can't see the outside, but I'll show you the outside of other Christian churches, early Christian churches. And they're always very simple, like brickwork usually. So there's really a very big focus on humility and simplicity in early church design. So something to be thinking about. And of course, after Constantine's edict, they have to have spaces to worship in. So they have to figure out, how to design these spaces. And this is what they come up with. Now, an interesting thing to note about the use of space in an early Christian church is that the nave was really considered sacred space. It was not to be occupied by anyone besides the clergy or the holy people, right? The priests and such. The worshipers stood in the aisles. So if you're looking at the photograph of the interior, behind the columns, essentially. So that space in the middle, the nave, would have been completely empty. Only the, church officials would have came and gone through that space, right? Used that space ritualistically. The worshipers would have been standing behind the columns in the aisle area, watching the proceedings, and standing, not sitting, standing. So you'll notice here in Santa Sabina, now that they use it as a church today, they had to bring chairs into the nave because there were no pews, nowhere to sit. Again, worshipers were meant to stand off to the side in the aisles. So the way we might think about a church space functioning, that's not how they originally functioned. And we think that perhaps it was a mark of piety to stand like this through a church service, because these services were sometimes like 4 hours long. They were all in Latin. Again, very, very different from what you would experience today in a church, as far as the entertainment value and, the comfort value that I think some people, just think is part of going to church today. Like, oh, of course there's going to be a nice padded pew for me to sit in. Not then. Not at all. So again, we have to think a little bit differently about the use of the space, right, by early Christian churches. This is a drawing of Old St. Peter's, so we can't actually see the building because it no longer exists, but this gives you a sense of how the space would have functioned. And again, the nave would have been sacred space. The aisles would have been where the worshipers stood. And of course, it's been heavily renovated, so it looks nothing like this today. And why St. Peter's? St. Peter was the head of the church, essentially. Christ gave the keys of the church to St. Peter to lead the church upon his crucifixion. And unfortunately for St. Peter, he met the same fate. But he is looked at as the church father, or the original pope, we might say, within the Catholic Church. So that's why old St. Peter's, right? Because of St. Peter's role. And I'll be showing you more architecture as we move along, and again, talking more about the humility, right, of the spaces and such. I also want to show you how sculpture, right, was used by early Christians and the role of syncretic practice. I've been alluding to this throughout our talk, so here you finally see it. Like, what is the Good Shepherd? The Good Shepherd's basically a reimagining of the calf bearer. So if you go back to archaic Greek, right, and look at the archaic Greek statues, you'll remember me talking about this piece and saying there's a reason why I'm showing you this piece. This piece originally was someone taking an animal to the temple to sacrifice under the pagan rules, right, of Greek religion. And I'd mentioned that, we would think about how that could be reinvented. So many people talk about how the Good Shepherd, the imagery of the early Christian Good Shepherd of Christ, was lifted, in a sense, from the calf bearer and sort of reappropriated or reimagined based on Christ's stories. It's pretty smart if you're thinking about syncretic thought and belief. It reinvents the idea of animal sacrifice because, again, pagans did animal sacrifice, Christians did not. So it sort of reinterprets, that idea in imagery and thought. And it pulls from, to me, a very expected way to look at Christ in the early Christian time. Because I think Christ, one of the things to keep in mind as we go along through the end of the class, where we're looking more heavily at Christian art, is that Christ, in my mind anyway, he changes to suit what the needs of that time are. Because he can be a lot of things to a lot of different people, however he's interpreted. So for me, the early Christians, they like to see Christ as a humble, simple man, which he was. But if you look at later imagery, medieval imagery, he's much more turned into like a glorious prince or like a judge, right? And it's sort of overblown, the imagery and how it's used. Here you'll notice he's very simple. He's very much the man of the people. He protects the flock. Even the, lost sheep he will go find and he will protect. So when I think about early Christians and the kind of imagery they like humility, they like simplicity, they like accessibility, like, can I feel a connection to this idea or image or person, right? So the early Christian idea of the Good Shepherd to me makes a lot of sense. Notice it also still looks really Roman. So we're still in that transition point between Roman to the new Roman. So to me, he still looks like a Roman. He's still kind of, behaving like a Roman. And in this one, I think you see it too, where he looks to me very Zeusian in this image. This is not something to me that speaks to a humble Christ. This is more to me the people who made this sculpture kind of thinking about the pagan gods they had always enjoyed and then how could they image Christ like him. So it's interesting to look at how early Christians use sculpture. And they didn't really make a lot of it. So that's another interesting change. You look at the Greeks and you look at the Romans and they made a lot of sculpture. They were heavily dependent on sculpture. We'll see that start to shift and downgrade as we move into more Christian-based art, where sculpture to them doesn't seem to be as of much interest. They start to move to like mosaics and paintings and other types of making art. So again, just something to ponder. And the final thing I really want to show you is the beginning of what we call the book arts. And the book arts are tied, of course, to literacy rising. And the reason literacy is rising is because sacred text is now important. So this is the Vienna Genesis, because it's the book of Genesis in the Bible. We call it the Vienna Genesis because it today lives in Vienna, Austria. So that's where the title comes from. But it's the book of Genesis, right? The first book, right, in the Bible. And so before this, we've not seen any book arts, because why? Nobody had books, nobody had scrolls, Why would they have those things? They didn't need to have those things. The reason to be literate was fairly limited. But now it's going to become much more important. But even then, I think you can think about a book through the lens of like the husband and wife portrait I showed you. Just because you got a book doesn't mean maybe you could read it. Maybe you were just wealthy enough to actually have it. So I think of these books often as being luxury goods to a certain extent. Shows off your position, shows off that, you're able to have these things, but again, perhaps you can't actually read them. So just like the husband and wife couldn't really read or write, maybe. Whoever owned this beautiful manuscript perhaps couldn't read or write either, which is why maybe there were pictures. We call these illuminated manuscripts. So you notice there's the text on the top, and then you have the picture on the bottom. Because just like children's books, maybe the person couldn't actually read the words, but they could look at the pictures and say, oh, okay, what's going on here? What is going on here, by the way, is Rebecca at the well. So it's the story of Rebecca at the well. And you'll notice it's a continuous narrative because you see Rebecca twice in the image as she moves down from the city, right, to water the camels. So it's not two different women. The woman in pink is Rebecca both times. And I always point to the fact that look now at the modesty and the piety of how women are dressed, where Christian women, they should know better than to flaunt their bodies. The woman, by the way, by the well kind of pouring the water, some people think of her as like old school paganism, a representation of like water goddesses or something. But she's also a contrast between the good, proper Christian woman of Rebecca and the ways of the past. So we think there are these little Easter eggs that were hidden in a lot of imagery at this time, kind of saying that was the old way, but this is the new way, right? Rebecca's proper. You want to be like Rebecca. So, but again, maybe people couldn't read. So you put the picture in place, right, so they could understand the story. Notice that you're still seeing some issues with technique. Rebecca's like as tall as the city. So that's, as I mentioned, going to continue. There will be problems with that and representation as we keep moving on and looking at the Byzantine and looking at the medieval and so forth. It's also really fascinating to look at how these books are made. They're made from animal skin. So something like calf skin or lamb skin, and you'll notice the terms that coordinate with that, like calf skin is called vellum, lamb skin called parchment. I put a video in your modules regarding making manuscripts, so it's something I would definitely watch. It's really interesting to watch how they prepare the animal hide and dye them. Like this one's dyed like a pink color, a purple color. Remember I told you purple was like the Roman color of royalty, so I don't think this is accidental, that they dyed it kind of like purplish color. I think, again, it was speaking to wealth, right, of the person who owned it. So we'll see a lot more of book arts, right, as we go along and talk about the role for a now literate culture who wants to have access to sacred text, wants to be able to read, right, the sacred books that they're following. And I always pose this question to end our discussion. Does this mean paganism is dead? Constantine, his proclamations, does that mean paganism is just dead? I'd argue no. But we learn to do what we need to do to get by. That's the beauty of society, is you learn to say and do the things that you know will protect you. So I bet a lot of those patricians were not real happy about Constantine's decision because it took the power away from them and inverted their power structure immediately. It was like, what Akhenaten did to the priests. Not good, right? No bueno. So, I don't think a lot of these patricians were probably going along willingly, but maybe they were making outward signals, like the Junius Bassus sarcophagus, that I'm on board. Because we find stuff like this. We find stuff that was still owned by patrician families in the years 300, 350, 400, 450, where you can clearly see them doing pagan things. So, on the surface, maybe they were like, yeah, we love Christianity. But, maybe these families, when they were off on their own, were like, no, we're doing what we used to do. We don't care about that. And another thing I think is funny is that the art's still really good. So patricians still had money, I guess, to pay the bills on their artists. So still see some contrapposto here and, realism in the body and such. But, again, I think that you have to be careful considering how long a transition takes. And think about that very historically, because the transition from paganism under the Roman system of polytheism to Christianity being fully entrenched is 100, 200, 300, 400, 500 years of transitioning. It's a long time. So this was not something where just Constantine snapped his fingers and everybody overnight was like, yep, we're Christians, that's that. There will be struggle, there will be pushback, but eventually Christianity will win out. And when we look at the Byzantine next, we'll talk about how Justinian and other emperors made sure that Christianity was going to become the sole focus, right, of the religious experience for these people, and there would be no more debate, right, about this question.